Tonight on Ukraine Today, minus 1,220 Russian troops. Why does Russia still refuse to stop the war? And what's really going on in the Kursk region of Ukraine? Oh, sorry, not Ukraine, not yet, still Russia. A war between the US and Russia. The Pentagon now talks about the risk of direct military confrontation. Putin backed out. The Russian dictator didn't show up for the talks in Istanbul, so how will the West respond to such disrespect? And the drone the Russian army is afraid of. Ukraine's military intelligence finally revealed the Magura. All that and more in today's episode of Ukraine Today. Hi there, we are from Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Robchun. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's begin. In the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces have reduced the Russian army by 1,220 soldiers. They destroyed 8 tanks, 13 armored vehicles and dozens of other units, including artillery and rocket systems. At the same time, Russian propaganda is losing its mind. Kremlin media screams that Ukraine forces are trying to invade the Kursk region again. Spoiler alert, Ukrainian troops never left Kursk in the first place.
The Ukrainian armed forces have spectacularly disposed of Russia's newest system worth $45 million. Ukrainian troops used strike drones to destroy a Russian Buk M3 surface-to-air missile system which was covering enemy forces on the ground. The Uragan-1 multiple launch rocket system was also turned into scrap metal. And also, in the Novopavlivka direction of the Donetsk region, Ukrainian defenders have for the first time demonstrated the combat use of a drone equipped with a grenade launcher. Meanwhile, Russia is pulling air defense systems into Crimea, sacrificing its own regions in the process. All of this is being done to maintain control over the peninsula, which for the Kremlin holds not only logistical, but also symbolic and even sacred significance.
Until recently, occupied Crimea was considered the most densely equipped with air defense and missile defense systems among the Russian occupation forces. But as we can see, this has yielded absolutely no results. The latest drone strike, according to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, IHM, was carried out and against military targets in Crimea, ranging from the Jankoy airfield to military facilities in Sevastopol.
But the Russians are not only afraid for Crimea, the occupying forces have not had any success near Chasiv Yar in the Donetsk region for quite some time. That's why the invaders have brought in a separate presidential regiment of the FSB to storm the city.
The battles for Chasiv Yar have been going on for almost 2 years now. The Russian occupation army, despite redeploying its most combat-ready units to this section of the front, and let me remind you, these are airborne divisions, units of the former Wagner PMC and FSB units, still cannot accomplish even tactical level objectives, such as taking full control of this settlement. Chasiv Yar holds strategic significance for both sides in the war. It is essentially the key to the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, 4 of the largest industrial centers in the Donetsk region, which are under the control of Ukraine's defense forces.
In most cases, the Russian occupiers send poorly trained conscripts into infantry assaults, even despite heavy losses. The goal of such actions is for Russia to have a better position in potential negotiations with Ukraine and the United States.
The Russian political and military leadership, disregarding the number of personnel losses, is trying to achieve at least the intermediate objectives of the so-called special military operation, namely the complete occupation of the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. It should be noted that in April, the losses of the Russian army were actually comparable to the losses during the large-scale Russian offensive from October to December 2024. At the moment, Russian army losses for the month of April amount to about 45,000 personnel.
Only the dictator himself boasts that the Kremlin is sending almost twice as many soldiers to the front as Ukraine and that Russians are volunteering to go to war. But all of this is a lie, and the main incentive to join the military is generous financial payments. In addition, there is active recruitment of convicts. And once again, Russian propaganda has claimed that the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to break through into the Kursk region.
Russian propagandists, yes, confirm the presence of Ukrainian defense forces in Tetkino. Moreover, there are reports of successful counterattacks and the threat of creating an operational encirclement of Russian units in the Lushkovsky district of the Kursk region. This refers to strikes on the logistical components of the Russian army, namely bridges and pontoon crossings, which have made it possible to block a significant number of Russian servicemen directly in the combat zone near Tetkino.
Also, according to propagandist reports, the Ukrainian armed forces are preparing a breakthrough in the Bryansk region.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling you the truth about this war. Click the link in the description and become our sponsor. Together to victory. And if you haven't already, click that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And now something unexpected. At the Pentagon, they started talking about a possible direct military confrontation between the United States and Russia. All the details in our next report.
The threat is no longer hypothetical. The world is rapidly approaching a direct military confrontation between great powers. The head of the U.S. Air Force Northern Command, Gregory Guilleau, presented a strategic report in which he explicitly named Russia, China, North Korea and Iran as America's key adversaries, and emphasized that the likelihood of a direct conflict with each of them is increasing.
Among the many events that are changing the strategic environment, three trends are of particular concern due to their immediate consequences for U.S. defense.
First, there is the risk of new wars breaking out. The world is already in a state of alarm. The largest conflict in Europe since World War II has been ongoing for 4 years. Russia's war against Ukraine, and this poses a huge risk for NATO. After all, Russia's strategic goal goes far beyond Ukraine's territorial borders, and any new turn of events could draw the U.S. into the fight.
At the moment, in the near term, well, by near term, I mean the next few months until the end of the year, in my view, the risks of a direct military confrontation between the US and Russia are purely theoretical, as was the case before for that matter. But earlier, yes, under Biden, such risks did exist. They were somewhat higher, but the Biden administration did everything possible to avoid any risks. And I think that Russia, too, was not ready, primarily because of the threat of nuclear war. It was not ready for a direct confrontation with the US. And now, under Trump, when both Trump and Putin want to reach an agreement with each other, they are trying to negotiate. The only obstacle is the issue of Ukraine. They can't agree on how to end the war in Ukraine, but overall, both sides now, the political leadership of both sides, are more inclined toward negotiations rather than military confrontation.
I don't see, as of today, the possibility of a direct confrontation between the US and Russia. It seems to me that this statement is more about US domestic politics, some kind of attempt to put pressure on the government, on congressmen, on the president, and so on. Because as far as I can tell, US-Russia relations are actually quite good at the moment.
Another hotspot is the Middle East. The war between Israel and Hamas, which is supported by Iran, has already drawn in American forces. And thirdly, there is the escalation in Asia. There are several hotspots at once: Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the Korean Peninsula. Moreover, North Korea has officially abandoned the idea of peaceful reunification, so it now only wants to use force. Therefore, it is possible that the truce, which has lasted for more than 70 years, could collapse at any moment. But the most alarming thing is the coordination of these threats. For the first time in a decade, America's enemies have begun to work together. After the war in Ukraine began, Russia strengthened its strategic ties with 3 of the United States adversaries at once. Moscow is increasing its cooperation with Beijing, but as well as with Pyongyang and Tehran.
Despite decades of mutual distrust, Beijing and Moscow seem determined to develop their strategic partnership and military cooperation in order to counter what they perceive as a constant threat from the United States to their core security interests.
Russia's rapprochement with China began long before the current war. Long before. Let me remind you, this includes BRICS, the SCO, and bilateral partnership relations. They were being formed throughout almost the entire presidency of Putin. Well, the rapprochement actually began even in the 1990s, but back then it wasn't a trend. For Yeltsin, the main priority was relations with the West. But Putin, especially against the backdrop of growing problems in relations with the West, drew closer and closer to China. Yes, under the conditions of war, economic and political rapprochement has intensified even further. Although there are also differences in the positions of China and Russia regarding the war, and this also needs to be taken into account. China, for example, has not recognized and does not recognize the annexation of the occupied regions, those regions that Russia has occupied in Ukraine, because it does not serve China's interests. They have the issue of Taiwan and the issue of Tibet. So for the Chinese, this is disadvantageous, but they really have grown closer. However, this rapprochement actually began about 20 years ago.
But will the world be able to avoid the threat of a major war? That question remains open. While global instability is increasing, China is deploying missile ships in the Bering Sea, sending out bombers with in-flight refueling and all nuclear submarines. Russia is patrolling the North American coast with strategic aviation and strengthening its submarine fleet. And North Korea and Iran are developing missile and cyber weapons capable of striking critical US infrastructure, from energy to communications. Meanwhile, concern is growing in the Pentagon. The military is calling for strengthening defense, increasing cooperation with allies, and focusing on preventive deterrence, while there is still time to stop all this.
Putin backed out. The Russian dictator didn't show up for the talks in Istanbul. He demonstrated his full commitment to continue the war and total disregard for Western leaders. Instead of coming in person, he sent a group of low-level officials, the same ones who back in 2022 were demanding Ukraine's surrender. The reaction came from the 37th President of the United States, Donald Trump.
I didn't anticipate. I actually said, why would he go if I'm not going? Because I wasn't going to go. I wasn't planning to go. I would go, but I wasn't planning to go. And I said, I don't think he's going to go if I don't go. And that turned out to be right. But we have people there. Marco, as you know, is doing a fantastic job. Marco's there, Secretary of State, and we have people there. But I didn't think it was possible for Putin to go if I'm not.
Now, what's wrong with that position? First of all, the key figures in the Istanbul talks were supposed to be Zelensky and Putin. It was Putin himself who insisted on restarting direct negotiations and even named the date, May 15th, that's today. Zelensky agreed and said he would be waiting in Turkey, specifically for Putin. Yes, the presence of Trump and other world leaders is important to ensure more witnesses, but their participation wasn't a requirement for Putin to show up. Second, let me quote Trump. President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate a possible end to the bloodbath. Ukraine should agree to this immediately. And Ukraine did agree. Putin ignored it, dismissed the words of an American leader, and now Trump acts like everything is just fine. What will the Russian dictator take away from that? Exactly, that he can keep doing the same thing. Third, Ukraine, Europe and the US all demanded a ceasefire first and only then negotiations. The very fact that Ukraine agreed to talks in Istanbul without a ceasefire, no silence on land, sea or in the air, was already a major concession. And once again, Russia spit in the face of the West, Trump's face included, if you will. And how did Trump respond? He didn't. Is there anything positive in all of this? Well, yes. Once again, the world saw that Putin cannot be trusted and that Ukraine, which wants peace, needs help immediately. President Zelensky has officially arrived in Istanbul. He's meeting with Turkish President Erdogan. He also expected to meet with Putin, but Putin got cold feet.
We have a delegation at the highest level, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, The military, our intelligence, representatives of all intelligence agencies, by the way, and in order to make any decisions that can lead to the expected just peace. As for the high-level meetings, we will start meetings with President Erdogan, with the entire Turkish delegation. We are in contact with the American side, and I think they will also have high-level Turkish meetings. We'll see, but I don't know the level of the Russians officially yet. But from what we see, it looks more like a sham level. We will think about what we will do, what our steps will be after talking to President Erdogan.
Let me remind you, Russia earlier refused a 30-day ceasefire proposal from the US and EU. Before leaving for Turkey, President Zelensky said this.
There is support for a direct meeting from the leaders of the Global South, and this voice is being heard. We also know China's position on the ceasefire and negotiations. The position of America and Europe is absolutely clear. In fact, it is now most obvious to everyone in the world, for the entire time of a full-scale war, and it is obvious that the only obstacle to establishing peace is the lack of a clear will of Russia to do so.
And finally, Ukraine's military intelligence just showed a Magura drone for the first time. Different versions of this drone have already destroyed 17 Russian sea and air targets. That includes 2 Mi-8 helicopters, 2 Su-30 fighter jets, and 3 major warships of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the Sergei Kotov, Ivanovets, and Cezary Kunikov. The damage? Over $500 million for Russia, and more importantly, thousands of Ukrainian lives saved. That's it for today. Thank you for staying with us. We read your comments and feel your support. Strength to our defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Like, subscribe, and see you soon.